So
welcome to our call tonight. I didn't know, none of us knew that we would be competing with the State of the Union, but here we are.
Recording in progress.
I'm Linda Marin, and I want to thank members of the Climate Alliance and Santa Cruz for Bernie and Santa Cruz Climate Action Network and Citizens Climate Lobby Santa Cruz and Equity Transit for organizing this call on an issue that affects our community directly and deeply, deeply as we endeavor to make land use decisions that serve the greatest good for addressing climate, transportation, and the needs of those members of our community who are often overlooked and not prioritized. Our vote in June on this issue, whether to preserve the rail and trail option or to commit the corridor to trail only, will have an enormous implication for our county. And I thank all of you for taking the time this time tonight to gather information. And I also thank Sally Arnold and Rosemary Sarka for sharing their expertise with us tonight. And without further ado, I'll introduce Sally. And I think that you will see some themes in her bio. Sally is a retired public school teacher and a former board chair of Friends of the Rail and Trail. She serves on the Transportation Committee of local Sierra Club. She's also on the Bicycle Advisory Committee to the Regional Transportation Commission, and she's part of the stakeholders group for the County Active Transportation Plan. And finally, she's on the campaign committee of No Way Greenway. Sally, the mic is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here with a community activist. You know, I get a chance to talk to lots of different groups, and they vary a lot, but I feel like this is a very highly charged crowd of people who are really active in the community, and it's an exciting opportunity for me. I have some slides to share, and I'm going to go through those, and then afterwards I'm going to put some links in the chat that would allow you to take action should you be so inspired after the talk, and then we'll be doing some Q&A after that. So let me just do a screen share here, and let's see. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. Let me try to minimize this thing so I can hit play. There we go. All right, how are we doing? You seeing that okay?
Excellent.
All right, great. Well, there are a lot of organizations that are working to improve our transit future in the county. And, some of them were listed in that bio that I'm involved with. It's one of those things where one thing just leads to another, and, you get involved in one transit group and it just keeps going. Friends of the Rail and Trail, I just wanted to make a distinction here, is an educational and advocacy group, been working for 20 years on this issue of the rail and trail together. No Way Greenway is a more recent group. It's just for the election. It's a campaign committee. And so you're going to hear some perspectives from both groups tonight. My presentation is going to start with a general orientation to the project, and then we're going to end with some of the challenges presented by the attacks on Roaring Camp, as well as on the ballot measure that's coming up. So, oops, how come my slides aren't advancing? Hang on. Oh, here we go. Okay. So first of all, some history. I think we all know that in the 19th century, rail lines were being built out all over the country. This was under the auspices of federal agencies, the Surface Transportation Board, and we got our rail tracks in the late 19th century here in Santa Cruz County. And the homes and businesses were all built close to those tracks. And today, about half our population lives within a mile of the tracks, and that includes 92 parks, 44 schools. And in places along the tracks, like between Santa Cruz and Capitola, we have urban densities like you would find in Oakland or Portland. And so even though lots of our county is rural, we do have those areas near the tracks are really quite urban. Of course, we are today living with the legacy of the 20th century transportation planning, and I think we are all very familiar with the problem. We have the less expensive housing in Watsonville, and we have most of the jobs and educational opportunities are in Santa Cruz, and in between we have a 90-minute gridlock. And it is, and it's only 20 miles, but it can take an hour and a half to go that distance one way at bad traffic time. And, you know, the time that people are spending in their cars, it's time they are not with their family, they're not engaged with their community. They're really doomed to sitting in that traffic unless there's an alternative. And we have to be honest, and the people bearing the greatest brunt of that, the greatest burden of this bad planning are the residents of South County. And there's definitely a race and class dimension to that we need to not ignore. There's also safety issues that need to be addressed. You know, we have the second highest rate of bike commuters in the state, second to Davis, but we also have one of the highest death rates and rates of serious injury for both cyclists and pedestrians in Santa Cruz County. Excuse me. And so we really need some infrastructure to keep people who are not in cars safe. And if there were a place for people to ride their bikes that was not in traffic, more timid, newer cyclists could gain some confidence, so they might be more willing to use their bikes in more places. Of course, you know, I don't have to tell the people in this group that the climate crisis is another big result of that kind of 20th century transit planning, or lack of transit, more like car planning. And you probably already know that more than half of our local greenhouse gas emissions are transportation related. So if we're serious about reducing our local greenhouse gas emissions, we need to address transportation. That's the place that we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck if we really want to reduce our climate emissions. And there's good news, because many of these problems I just laid out can be addressed by this rail and trail project. Our rail line was built by the Regional Transportation Commission, the RTC, you'll hear me refer to them later, to be used for transit and for trail. And the Monterey Bay Scenic Sanctuary Trail Master Plan is that plan. And it, as you can imagine, those rail lines go through multiple jurisdictions, different cities and counties, the Coastal Commission, all of those have approved this master plan. And that is the plan that is being implemented. And sometimes this is called the project of record. It's like the approved project that is being implemented. And basically, the project works like this. First, we build the trail between Davenport and Watsonville. That's about 32 miles. Then we use the tracks for zero emissions passenger rail. And that will just be between Santa Cruz and Watsonville. That's like a light rail, kind of a commuter rail sort of situation there. And then we need to organize our buses with what's called pulse scheduling. So at every transit stop, there's a bus waiting for you to take you to your destination if your destination doesn't happen to be close enough to the tracks for you to walk. But if you are going to walk or ride your bike to your destination, we need safe streets. We need sidewalks, we need bike lanes, all of those things are needed so we can move around the county without our cars. And the trail is being built. So segment 8 is the San Lorenzo River Trestle. That was completed in 2019. It came in ahead of schedule and under budget. It's won several design and engineering awards. And segment 7A on the west side of Santa Cruz was completed a little more than a year ago, and it has totally transformed the way people are moving around around the county. I mean, around the west side. If you're a west sider, you know it's just amazing what you see out there on that trail. Then also built is the segment 18A, the beginning part of segment 18 in Watsonville, and it's connecting several slough trails in Watsonville. If you're a South County person, you may have used that trail already. And then there are segments that are designed and out to bid. For example, segment 7B, which is going to go from like Bay in California, sort of parallel to Bay Street, and then come out at the wharf. If you've ever tried to get from, say, the west side there down to like the wharf area, you know you either have to go down a very steep, busy street, Laurel Street, or a steep and busy tourist impacted area in front of the Dream Inn, and it's not safe. And This will provide a 2% ADA grade, very gentle way for people to get from the west side down to the beach area without having to navigate traffic or hurdle down a steep hill. So it'll be a really great way to encourage more people who are maybe a little too timid to take on Laurel Street, a way to get around town. Also, there's a lot of children who live in Beach Flats who go to school at Bayview, and this will be a safe way for them to get to school as well. And then segment 5 on the North Coast, it goes from Wilder Ranch up to Davenport, is designed and fully funded. The Coastal Commission recently signed off on some of the last bits of that, and it's being funded by the Federal Lands Access Program, and it's scheduled to be built in 2024. There are several segments that basically reach from the San Lorenzo River Trestle all the way to Aptos, that are in design and environmental review process right now. And in an effort to expedite the process, they've kind of combined all these segments, and multiple agencies are working on these together. And when you think about it, when those are finished, it's going to connect a lot of very busy places like Seabright, the Boys and Girls Club, Simpkins Swim Center, the Live Oak Schools, and Capitola Village, and several state beaches are all going to be very close to this trail. Again, accessible safely by bike or pedestrian or scooter or whatever, away from traffic. So it's going to really change the way people move around Mid-County when that's done. So there's a reason why it's a rail and trail plan. Bikes and trains work and play well together. A matter of fact, transit planners have found that when they build transit infrastructure and bike infrastructure together, more people ride bikes and more people take trains. They just really naturally work well together. And this is why the Bicycle Advisory Committee to the RTC and Bike Santa Cruz County are all supporting the Rail and Trail project together. It's a way to extend the range of cyclists. And of course, this level boarding that rail can provide is a wonderful way to allow independence for people who have assisted mobility devices, whether it's a cane or a walker, or they're pushing a stroller with their baby. Just not having to heft it upstairs on and off a bus is just much easier and much more, there's a lot more kind of dignity in the boarding and disembarking process. And this is why the Elderly and Disabled Transportation Advisory Committee to the RTC also is supporting the Rail and Trail project together. And if we add rail to our transit mix, studies have shown that just locally, we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions enough to be equal to planting 61,000 trees year after year, because there are people who will get out of their cars and they will ride that train. And this is why Sierra Club, Regeneracion, Pajaro Valley, Youth for Climate Justice, they're all supporting the Rail and Trail project. So why is it that people are willing to, leave their car behind for rail transit when they don't do it for bus transit? It's because buses are stuck in the same traffic you'd be in if you were in your car. And it's like, well, I can be, stuck in traffic in a bus, or I can be stuck in traffic in my car. If you have a choice, if you don't, people will choose their car. But rail travel is faster because it's not stuck in the same traffic as everybody else. And if you look at these projected travel times, it's amazingly faster than traveling around by car right now in our county, especially at high commute times. And when you think about it, you look at that travel time, 41 minutes, Watsonville to Santa Cruz. It's 90 minutes now. Basically cutting somebody's commute time in half, giving them back 40 minutes each way. That's about an hour and a half each day that a family would get back from their loved one that is spending that time in traffic right now. It's an equity issue. Because of all these reasons why people would prefer rail transit, they found that adding rail to our transit system locally will lead to a 25% increase in people using public transit countywide over what the number of people using it now. And that includes additional people using Metro. Because of that pulse scheduling I showed you earlier, people will be able to just step off a train, step on a waiting bus, and get to their final destination if it doesn't happen to be right next to the rail line. And, we're part of something a lot bigger. It's not just about our county. These are plans that are being made regionally and statewide. On the right, you can see the schematic of the regional plan for what the Transit Agency of Monterey County is calling Around the Bay train service. And on the left, you can see, that's on the left. And on the right, you can see the statewide rail plan. And in both cases, you can see our little branch line is a key part of it. And because Santa Cruz is such a destination for people, you got to imagine now people who live in, I don't know, these other cities on the map, Salinas, Gilroy, who might be coming to Santa Cruz right now by car. Imagine if they could just hop on a train to get here and not have to worry about parking their car down at the boardwalk. They might come and have lunch in Aptos and then go onto the boardwalk for the day and then have dinner in Capitola on the way home. All those big tourist centers are right on the rail line. And they imagine it's like tourists without traffic. And that's why, there's a lot of groups involved in economic development, like the Chambers of Commerce, that are supporting this plan because they see that it's going to be good for our economy and good for jobs. And for all these reasons, the vision is really popular. Polling was done last year by FM3, a respected polling company around the state, that found that 74% of our active voters in Santa Cruz County support the rail and trail vision together. 74%, it turns out, is really high. And look at this, across all the supervisorial districts. I mean, it varies, but more than half of the voters in every supervisorial district want to see rail and trail together. This is the one I love. If you look at the bottom of these bars, you can see the different demographics that are being represented, regardless of age, gender, political party, race, economic status, how close you live to the rail line. Everybody, the majority of those groups, want to see rail and trail together. I mean, that's just really unusual to see anything be that popular. And so, I mean, that's really good news for us. We have a big infrastructure project coming along and it's got strong community support. And so that's really exciting. And that community support can also be seen by all these businesses and organizations that are supporting it. This is a screenshot off our website that shows, all these businesses and groups that, want to see rail and trail together. And there's ways that you can get involved. You can subscribe to get updates of what's happening with the project. You can follow us on social media. You can invite us to speak, and do presentations like this. So there's lots of ways that you can support the project. And I'll tell you, this used to be the end of my presentation, but there's some threats that have come up recently to this project. Popular is not, doesn't necessarily mean 100% popular, and it only takes a small vocal minority to raise a fuss. And we've been seeing some of that fuss lately. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of those challenges or threats to this popular project. I was asked to talk a little bit about the Roaring Camp situation, and I know Rosemary is going to give you way more detail about this than I ever could, but I'll just give you like sort of the map of the situation and how it became to be like that Roaring Camp was somehow under attack here. The yellow line represents the Santa Cruz branch line. That's where we're talking about building the rail and trail. You can see the blue line to the right. That's the rest of, that's where we connect to the rest of the state rail network and the rest of the nation's rail network for that matter. And you notice that the junction is at Pajaro. This is, if we build this out, Watsonville is going to become a real transit hub. It's going to be great for the economy of Watsonville, but that's a little bit of a side issue. So look at the red arrow. That's where Roaring Camp's, where we think of like Roaring Camp is, but they also own the whole rail line that connects, that black line that connects from the arrow down to the yellow rail line. Okay, so that's their rail line. Now, the branch line, the yellow one that's owned by the RTC or us, by us as taxpayers, and the privately owned line that goes up to Roaring Camp are all in what's called the Federal Rail Network and under the jurisdiction of the Surface Transportation Board. And it's sort of the legacy of this federal rail system that freight can be carried on these lines to help, the economy of the country, basically. So if somebody wants to tear up tracks like the Greenway people do, they have to file with the federal government for something called rail banking, which sounds like you're going to save your tracks, but really it means you're going to get permission to tear them up. And And you can't, and the rail and the Surface Transportation Board will usually not give you permission to rail bank and tear up your tracks if somebody who's using the line objects. Well, you can see why Roaring Camp needs access to that yellow line, because that's how they're going to get their equipment in and out. If they need a new locomotive, it's going to come in on that blue line, it's going to get on the yellow line, and then it's going to go up the black line to where they have their business. And so if the yellow tracks are torn out, they're stranded. So they've been saying, we object to the idea of tearing up those, in this scheme, yellow tracks, the Santa Cruz branch line. And so some people had this idea, well, what about this? What if we take Roaring Camp's line out of the federal rail network by something called third-party adverse abandonment? Then they'll be out of business and they can't object to tearing up the yellow tracks anymore. And so that's kind of the big picture of what's going on and why Roaring Camp is threatened. Like I said, Rosemary will do a much better job than I of explaining how this will deeply impact their business. But I think the point is that the people who don't want to see us get clean light rail will stop at nothing. I mean, if they have to destroy a locally owned business, it's like, okay, that's just collateral damage to them. But those of us who want to see clean light rail and an excellent bike trail and a chance for people to get out of their cars, are standing firm. And there was an outpouring of support for Roaring Camp's business. And I think it's really alerted a lot of people to the threat that those folks who would like to tear up the tracks are bringing to our community. So this is where the No Way Greenway campaign comes in. So I think that in the fall, Greenway supporters were circulating a petition. And what they said, they know that the rail and trail project is popular. So what they didn't say, hey, do you want to tear up the tracks? They said, would you like to build the trail and rail bank the tracks, which sounds like you're going to save them. But rail banking really is a way to tear up the tracks, and so people would be like, oh, okay, they would sign it. Well, it's going to be on the ballot in June. And it's been intentionally made confusing because they knew that if they said, would you like to sign a petition to tear up the tracks? People would not sign it. I mean, a few people would, but not the majority. And so so it's been intentionally made confusing and deceptive. And here's what the impacts are going to be. Okay, first of all, it's going to delay trail development because that whole Monterey Bay Scenic Sanctuary Trail Master Plan we talked about, that took like a decade to develop and get all those approvals. If we have to start all that over again, we're talking about delay there. Additionally, if we actually have to tear up those tracks, think of the time that's going to take instead of just building in the space next to the tracks. And so we're going to have trail delay if we pass the Greenway Initiative. Also, because if you read all 9 pages of that legal language in the measure, it removes all references from rail planning from the general plan. So how can we have future rail transit if we're not allowed to plan for it? And because they insist that the trail must be built where the tracks are now rather than next to it, it calls for track removal. And that's going to be very expensive. And you got to think about, in this picture, you can see the ties and you can see the rails, but look at all that gravel. That's what's called the ballast. And there's a deep bed of ballast. And think about 150 years of freight trains going over that. God only knows what's dripped into that. If we expose that, it's going to be a toxic waste site. And we're going to have to deal with that. And God knows what the mitigations are going to look like for that. And so it's good infrastructure we can use now. Let's leave it alone. Don't expose it. Let's put it to use for our community. And the other thing that's going to happen is, of course, because we lose the option for rail transit, this trail-only scheme of theirs is just not for everybody. If you cannot drive a car for whatever reason, there's nothing for you there. If you can't afford to drive a car, there's nothing there for you. I mean, really, who's going to walk or bike 20 miles to work for 8 hours, and then walk or bike 20 miles back to work, back home? I mean, it really targets our South County residents, and it's dooming them to a future of long commutes or sitting in a bus on a long commute. Now, of course, there's also the big climate impact. We know that most of our emissions are transit related. And if we do not do something about that, if we eliminate our best chance to reduce those climate emissions, we're just going to be doomed to more of the same, escalating climate disasters. So I know I've referred to rail banking, and I'm just going to talk about it a little bit more. Like I said, it's this federal legal maneuver that allows you to remove the tracks, and it takes legally the tracks out of the federal system. And it's been in use for 40 years, and there are some places where people really didn't want to use their tracks, and they were turned into trails, and that's fine if that's what's right for that community. But in 40 years, about 25,000 miles of track have been rail banked and the tracks removed around the country. And in cases where those tracks were then paved over with a trail like Greenway's proposing, never has that trail been torn up and then restored to rail service. And this is another way in which their initiative is deceptive, because they talk about it's going to be an interim trail. You could always tear it up later. And it's like, well, I guess you could, but let's just think about the logic of that. You've got some tracks and you've got space for a trail next to it. Instead of building the trail next to the tracks, they're saying tear up those tracks, put the trail over there. Then later, tear up that trail, put the tracks back, and now build another trail. I mean, I can't imagine anything more wasteful and expensive. So, we talked about that 74% popularity. These are just so far, as of today, the endorsers for the No Way Greenway campaign. And because this issue cuts across all the usual fissures in our community, political fissures, you'll see all kinds of people that you wouldn't expect to see on the same side on these lists. And it's growing every day. I mean, every time you click on that website, you're going to see like new groups, new individuals, new elected officials. And some of these people on the elected officials, they're running against each other for the same seat, but they agree on this issue. Or they're people who were bitter opponents over, say, the Santa Cruz City Council recall, which was, a pretty bitter fight. And yet they agree on this issue. And you'll see environmental groups and business groups in the organizations. They agree in this issue, though oftentimes, they don't agree on other issues. And so this is an interesting opportunity for us, but it's also going to be a challenge as we move through this campaign this spring. On one hand, we have this wonderful opportunity to have this broad coalition. The majority of the county can gather together under this banner of opposing the plan to tear up the tracks. But it's going to be a challenge, because we're going to be working with people who we don't usually work with, and we don't even like. And we're going to have to hang together through this process and not let others try to divide us, because we agree on this for differing reasons, perhaps, but we agree that the rail and trail project together is what's best for our county. So there's lots of things you can do. You can follow the No Way Greenway campaign on social media. You can go to the website, you can endorse the campaign, and you can also sign up to be a volunteer, and then you'll get announcements about when things are coming that you can do to help. And you can also invite us to speak, like I'm doing now, at your PTA or your garden club or your neighborhood group or whatever group it is. We'll go anywhere, and we can customize the presentation to be as short or as long as you want. And if you don't like my presentation, we can send you somebody else. There's lots of people who can do this. So I'm going to stop sharing now. I'm going to put some things in the Zoom. And then, in the Zoom chat, and then we'll take some questions and answers, I think.
So, Laurence, do you have questions for Sally now?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Sally. I think we have a few minutes for questions. So let me start with Lou, who asked, did any local tribes or people of most likely descent respond to the environmental impact reports for the trails?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. We have a question, and actually I'm going to combine those. A few questions, which you've already, Sally, you already gave us a lot of suggestions on how to really respond to the negative messaging from Greenway. Mm-hmm. But Maria Mead and Amy, really, perhaps you can give us a little bit more specifics. Their questions have to do with, the loudest critiques on they say tracks are old to use and must be replaced. The cost is too high and it will take too long. Plus trestles, aren't wide enough. And yes, and then also that's South County don't really want the electric rail and won't really use it. You know,
Well,
that's a lot of things
that's
in
a lot.
one.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm gonna hit a few of them. If I miss one, because I maybe didn't keep them all in my head, just remind me, okay?
Okay.
But yeah, those are very familiar concerns. Well, as you saw from the survey, the people living in South County do want the rail and trail. Matter of fact, that was one of the, they had one of the tallest bars of people who want the rail and trail. So, I mean, I'm sure you can find some individuals there who don't, but I can find people on my block who don't, but that doesn't mean that's the majority. The other thing is that, about cost, you know, this cost question is kind of interesting. When it's something that somebody wants to do, they don't ask about cost. When they don't want to do it, all of a sudden they're very concerned about the cost. For example, and we see this happen at RTC meetings all the time. The staff will present, hey, let's widen this next section of highway. And many of the commissioners are like, okay. They don't ask anything about the cost. They don't ask where the funding's going to come from. But when it's like, okay, let's fix this trestle. Oh boy, that might cost some money. I don't know where we're going to get the money. They're just held to entirely different standards. And so, yeah, you know what? Infrastructure projects are expensive. We're talking big money, millions of dollars, but it's cheaper than highway widening, and it's going to move a lot of people faster. And it's more of an equity issue because you don't have to own a car. Highway widening, aside from being an environmental disaster, always involves private car ownership, and there's a class divide there that needs to be, you know, considered. So the question is not, is it going to be expensive? Yes, it is. There's a state rail plan that we are paying taxes into right now to fund, and those taxes are being used to build rail projects in other counties, and we can just keep, you know, being generous and funding those projects, or we can bring some of that money back home and fund our local project here. Did I miss anything in that list?
Just one thing, and actually Nancy has stated also that she read a recent letter about the impossibility of making a trail wide enough with the rail in place and have it, you know, safe for all modes of travel.
Well, if you look at the West Side Trail, a show of hands if you've seen the West Side Trail. Anybody? Okay, that's what we're talking about. It's one of the widest trails in California. I mean, I'm on it almost every day. It seems very safe to me. I see children learning to ride their bikes. I see people in wheelchairs. I see blind people. I see dog walkers. It's a very safe trail. I don't understand why they think it's going to be dangerous. There are some places that are narrower than others. There's places where there's going to need to be a retaining wall. There's places where the tracks, like if this is the right of way, the tracks are kind of in the middle. So you want to move the tracks a little bit to the side to make more room on the side. I mean, it's a construction project. Just like, I guess highway widening is the best example. You know, think about all the retaining walls and bridges that have to be built when they do a highway widening project. It's a big project, but the difference is this one is a climate friendly project.
Okay, thank you. I have another question for Lou, and perhaps one more question after that, and then I think we need to probably move on. So Lou says, I have a question regarding what exemptions from the environment and cultural resource management laws and local regulation you are aware of that the SPP line receives as a freight rail carrier.
Yeah, that's interesting. This is one of those reasons why, I mean, I'm all for, I was an environmental studies major in college. I'm an environmentalist. I'm active with the Sierra Club. So what I'm going to say may sound kind of shocking, but the person who asked that question is right. STB, federally controlled rail lines, are exempt from some environmental regs. In our case, this time, it's probably going to be to our benefit, because as long as we stay in that system, the big environmental damage has been done. When they built the rail line in the 19th century, and they laid the track, and they put in the ballast, and they, they dug drainage ditches, and they built retaining walls. That work was done 150 years ago, and it was damaging. That damage has happened, and now we can use it to prevent other damage from happening from climate change. But if we take our rails out of that federal protection and tear them up, as Greenway suggests, and then they say, well, then you have the right to put them back. Well, good luck getting permission, because you're going to have to redo that environmental damage that was done 150 years ago. And so rather than create more damage by tearing it up and then maybe create more damage by adding it back, just leave it alone. The damage is done, it exists, but we can use it for good now. So it's a kind of a fine needle to thread, but I hope that explains it.
Okay, thank you. And let's take one final question, which you also went over during your presentation. Perhaps you can re-clarify, is with the current tracks, how do you accommodate trains that run with enough frequency so that the service is convenient for regular use?
Well, you know, this is one of those things where it's one of those rail nerd things you learn as you start to get into this. What we have is what's called a single track, and most rail systems are single track. And so what happens is, like, I don't know, here's the track. And what they'll do is they'll create just in a certain place a parallel track next to it. It's called a siding. Usually that'll happen like at a station, so that when two trains are coming, they can be coming at the same time, and then they just go side by side for that little bit. And usually, like I said, it's at a station, so passengers get on and off, and then the trains go back on the single track after that. And that's a typical way to run a rail line, and you could be running trains pretty frequently in both directions. I believe that if we have two sidings, we can run trains 30 minutes in both directions, and if we have three sidings, we can run them in 20-minute intervals. And the more sidings you put up, the more frequently, the more frequent you can have service.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're passing the mic on to Lonnie, I think.
Okay. And if people have other questions that come to them, I put a bunch of links in the chat, and just, send questions to info@rail&trail, and, I'm happy to answer them. Because I know sometimes, this is a lot to digest, and you might just be like sitting on it, and then you think of things, and, as I was introduced, I'm a retired teacher. I love to answer questions and teach people things. So just reach out if you think of something.
Thank you, Sally. Lonnie?
I think perhaps I'm supposed to be introducing Lonnie and Rosemary. My name is Pauline Seals. I'm part of Santa Cruz Climate Action Network. We think this is very important for the climate, for social justice equity. So I'm especially interested in learning more about the roaring camp aspect of this. And Lonnie is going to introduce Rosemary. Lonnie, are you there?
Lonnie noted in the chat that she was not able to unmute.
Perhaps, okay, so hang on just 1 second, people. Perhaps I didn't make Lonnie. Lonnie came in twice, and maybe the second time I did not make her a co-host. So let me just double check that quickly. I can find her. Lonnie, make co-host. Okay, try again, Lonnie. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. Thank you so much, Pauline. I appreciate that. And I just want to say thank you, Sally. That was a fantastic presentation. I'm a cyclist, past triathlete, and I can't wait to bike down all the way to Monterey and then have lunch and some drinks in Monterey once the state rail plan is in place. Of course, Monterey's building rail to Watsonville. And once we get our rail to Watsonville, then I'd be able to take the train back after a nice lunch. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you, Sally, for bringing that information to the group. I am so grateful and want to introduce Rosemary Sarka, who is the corporate secretary for Roaring Camp Railroads with us. She's with us today, and I'm going to do an interview style with some questions. And of course, she might have far more information than even the questions that I've posed here. So welcome, Rosemary, and thank you for your time.
Rosemary, you should be able to unmute yourself now. Rosemary, you need to unmute.
Yep.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you. And Rosemary had another engagement tonight, and so she's really gone above and beyond by giving up her time to join us this evening. So again,
I'm happy to. Thank you.
I wanted to give a little summary. January 3rd, at the January 3rd RTC meeting, a group of individuals from the public inquired about a potential action being sought by the RTC staff and some of the commissioners to seek adverse abandonment of the rail line to be considered behind closed doors. This group urged the RTC commissioners to bring this issue into the light of public awareness with further discussion that happened on the January 13th RTC meeting. And since adverse abandonment of the rail is directly related to this very hot topic of the Greenway Initiative on our June 7th ballot, we thought that was really important. So it became very clear at this that the RTC staff and some commissioners were indeed seeking adverse abandonment of the Felton branch line, and that the topic was put on the RTC agenda for public discussion on February 4th, thanks to these conversations that happened in January. What happened then was over 6,000 emails were sent to the commissioners prior to the February 4th meeting, which is just amazing. They've never received that many emails, maybe 300. They got over 6,000 and probably more even after that, opposing abandonment of the Felton branch line and in support of Roaring Camp. So Roaring Camp actually on January 19th and another January 26th, two separate press releases from Roaring Camp did a really great job of addressing questions that the public might have and provide some insightful answers. I've posted the links to those press releases on Instagram at Equity Transit SC in the bio. But I'm really excited and want to hear from Rosemary, that she had the time to tell us a little bit about the history of Roaring Camp and how Roaring Camp has been a part of and has served this community. How long is it a family business? Who does it serve? How many people does it serve? And how does Roaring Camp impact our county? One of the things I think about with Roaring Camp is that all our kids, our families and our kids' families, we got together at Roaring Camp for every Halloween and Easter and riding the holiday trains. And, I know that Roaring Camp offers much more than just that to the community.
Yeah, well, Roaring Camp, as you noted, it was founded in 1958 by Norman Clark. He was a true visionary, just an amazing person. And I knew him, although I became involved with Roaring Camp, around 1972. But Norman died way too young, and he left it to his widow, Georgie Clark, who managed it for 35, close to 40 years, I think it was. And Georgie was such a good sport. She liked working the barbecue. She had no intention of running a company. and it's a tricky operation. There's a lot to it. You're working with federal regulations, federal retirement requirements for railroads. You're running a catering business. You're running a school, historic resource center for kids. So that was really a challenge. Georgie died just a few years ago, and the company is now run by her daughter. So we are into the third iteration of Clark's and the second generation. And Melanie is doing a really great job because it has become a lot more complicated to run a railroad. And this is a very good example of how that happens. Roaring Camp is beloved in Santa Cruz generally, and in many other places as well. It serves the tourist community and brings in a lot of a lot of tourist dollars to Santa Cruz because it's one of the principal attractions, but it also serves the local community. The Holiday Lights train is a favorite for many people. We also sponsor, it's the San Lorenzo Women's Club that runs the Mountain Fair around Memorial Day in normal years. And Roaring Camp provides the venue for that and gives all of the money to the Women's Club. So it's a complete charity event. In addition to that, for many people in Santa Cruz, this was their kid's first job. So they really like it that way. It just brings out a lot. It's one of those businesses where you can say to people, did you have a good time? And they say, yes, it was great. And that's a special pleasure.
I have to say, I know of many kids who actually worked at Roaring Camp during the summers, and it was a great opportunity. And I remember you saying in another interview something about the fires that Roaring Camp served as a important hub during.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Lanny, because it has been a staging ground for the fire departments in the San Lorenzo Valley since the inception. And Milani talks fondly about the rallies and training sessions that were held at Roaring Camp. It's been a favorite there. Even it was very much used during the last fires, during the 2 years ago, the fires. Has never been as close as it was at that time, but it was just amazing. So we've had a lot of support from the fire departments in San Lorenzo Valley and otherwise. There's a possibility of one of the things that freight could bring in is water. We have rescued people from the San Lorenzo River that you can't get to by car. We bring in personnel to work on the fires. And we also bring in and could bring in lumber for rebuilding. We were a freight operator, and we're still classified as a freight operator until relatively recently. And one of our main customers was San Lorenzo Lumber, bringing in lumber to the yard in the San Lorenzo, which is right next to us.
Yeah, and so in talking about the adverse abandonment and this attempt by, or this potential attempt by RTC to do adverse abandonment, what would be the impact of this adverse abandonment on Roaring Camp in the county, and how does the federal protections of the freight line relate to operations with Roaring Camp?
Yeah, what the freight classification offers is federal protection. And that's the root of what keeps our business alive. There are several offshoots of that which affect our business. For one thing, if we lose the classification of freight rail, that cuts us off from the main line. If we can't get to the main line, we can't bring in equipment. We have 2 locomotives right now in Watsonville. One of them is being used for freight in Watsonville, which is doing beautifully, which is really great. But we can't bring those locomotives north to Roaring Camp. So if our equipment dies, because while it's not historic on the big tree lines, it's still pretty old. If we can't bring that up by rail, we can't bring it up, period. And the RTC seems to not get that picture. They keep saying, can't you do it by truck? Can't you take it apart and bring it in by truck? No, we can't do any of those things. It would be like dismantling an ocean liner and moving it cross country. Think of putting a locomotive on a truck and going up Highway 17. I mean, it's laughable. And we can't bring it up Highway 1 because the bridge clearances aren't sufficient. Plus, we would have to close Highway 1. And that is just not not feasible. Even at midnight, it would not be feasible. So for that reason, that's really a problem. But even more than that, we have federal protection right now to run from the boardwalk, because when we got trackage rights on the boardwalk, to the boardwalk, when Norman bought the Big Trees line, he got trackage rights. That means that we can run from, because our line ends at Chestnut Street, running from Chestnut to the boardwalk, we are running on public lines that are right now owned by the RTC. And we have indefinite trackage rights on that. If we lose our freight status, we no longer have trackage rights. So we can't, that ruins our business model. We can't get to the boardwalk, no matter how many times people from Greenway say, oh, stop at the depot. It's not the same. You've got people, as Sally talked about previously, you know, people who are disabled. Think of walking from the depot to the boardwalk. You know, it's way too difficult for people to do. And the boardwalk would very much object. Now, the RTC has said to us that they would offer a license, you know, a 20-year license, a 30-year license even. Won't that satisfy you? No, it won't, because, and I just have to be very candid about this, we don't trust the RTC. The RTC can change. It already has changed in the last few years. Now we have a 6-6 shift in terms of who will support rail. One election can change that. Right now we have federal protection. If they offer us a license, even if they say, look, it would be a contract, you can't hold a political entity to a contract. The winds change all the time. And in that case, if we can't get to the boardwalk and Roaring Camp are in big trouble. That is really the ruination of the business. When Norman bought the Big Trees line in 1984, he got a right of first refusal on the branch line. So any part of the branch line that was going to be sold, whether it's a fee or the lease on the line, Roaring Camp had the option of buying that up. But when the branch line was sold to the RTC, we were told, you don't need to exercise, you must relinquish your right of first refusal on the branch line, because we will take care of you. There's no way that anybody's going to interfere with your trackage rights. You've got those trackage rights. Of course, it's for the good of the community. You have to give up your right of first refusal. And we formally and officially did give up in the contract when Union Pacific sold it to the RTC. We relinquished our right of first refusal with the promise that we would be protected. Well, you see in this situation how good that promise was.
Absolutely.
Now it's being very much threatened.
That was definitely a breach of trust. And, you know, I imagine that having to make decisions going forward, you have to take that into consideration in light of this. You know, I was going to ask the question is, do you feel that this was an aggressive move by the RTC staff?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was an aggressive and just plain mean move. You know, when we heard about this, we all thought it was a slip of the tongue. We all thought it was just a mistake. What? You're going to file abandonment on the Felton line? Right. You know, we thought they were prepared to file abandonment on the branch line, and we have been. That's the reason we're carrying freight in Watsonville. That the Progressive owns the operating contract on the branch line. And if they were to have abandoned freight, then the branch line would be abandoned. So we are flexible. We said, okay, look, if you won't abandon, we will carry freight. And we have been doing that and doing it very successfully. And Progressive is happy to do that. Progressive is a railroad, and railroads respect one another.
Well, I wanted to go back a little bit. There's a lot of things that you had said earlier that kind of piqued my attention. And one of them is about the trucking and bringing the engines in by truck. It's interesting that I think a lot of us may be or may not be aware in the 1940s and 1950s, as these various industries pretty much destroyed and pulled out freight systems, freight rail across the country, that had a really big impact. And one of the statistics I use is that it takes 1 gallon of fuel to move 1 ton of freight 500 miles. So you compare just even the worst diesel engine, the most polluting diesel engine, it's still the most fuel efficient, the most environmentally wise way of moving things, moving freight.
No, it really is, except that there are so many developments in freight, and electric freight is very much under consideration. There's been a good amount of talk about, well, if we have to take out the bridges over Aptos, let's just rebuild them as, for possibly light rail or even just pedestrian and bikes. And then, 100 years from now, we can build it for trains. If we're going to rebuild bridges, why not seek the widest possible flexibility for them? Why not, since you have the opportunity and you have to rebuild that bridge, build it for freight tolerance? Because quiet, efficient electric freight is right around the corner. It may not be Roaring Camp that will handle the freight. That's okay.
Yeah.
We just want to make sure that freight is available. And it is. There are so many things, especially you think about something that's not only the fuel efficiency, which I think is extremely important, but you guys have much better statistics than I do on that. But it's also issue of safety. Those trucks going over 17, there is a lot of people. I've lived through several of those accidents that hit the front page of the paper because of trucks losing brakes and things like that.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Yeah.
We could bring up so much by freight. Just even a couple of times a week, we could run groceries.
Yes. Thank you for
get those big
that.
Safeway trucks off 17.
Absolutely. There's so many things we could do by freight. And of course, not blaming truckers, as we had, talked about at another point, not blaming truckers, but the trucking industry itself shifting, again, that systems approach of how to shift to more environmentally wise transit, which would be electric rail. And that would be the future. You had talked a little bit about the Aptos Bridge, and I wanted to mention that I understand, according to the purchase agreement, the RTC is held responsible for the repair of the line and bringing it to Class 1, which makes it both passenger and freight rail capable. What is your understanding of this responsibility of the RTC?
Yeah, it isn't so much the purchase agreement as it is the operating agreement. The RTC is now in its second iteration of an operating agreement. And that's something that Greenway points to, look, they say you've had 3 operators that have failed. Well, that's completely untrue and understandable by certain standards. First of all, Sierra pulled out when Union Pacific sold the line. Okay. And then Iowa Pacific came in. Now, bless their hearts, the RTC has reviewed various operators, and Roaring Camp has always come in second. We've applied, but we've come in second because the first guy to get the contract has promised the moon. And we have not promised the moon. We've said this is what we could do. But we can't rebuild your bridges. we don't have the ability to do that. We don't have the funds to rebuild the bridges. So the first operator, Iowa Pacific, had a lot of problems financially before and after they came in. They failed for reasons completely unrelated to their operations on the rail. But the operating agreement that they bought into said that they had to do a whole bunch of things to maintain the line, more than really anybody could do. The maintenance of the line is a real burden, and the operators that have looked at it have said it's a failing contract. Nobody could do what is required. So when Progressive came in, they said, okay, we will maintain the line, but you've got to repair it first. And that was the agreement. So RTC has not repaired it. In fact, they have not even maintained it to the point where it could be easily repaired. We at Roaring Camp are used to bridges. We're used to repairing. We make those kinds of arrangements. We recently in Watsonville, it's not even our property. It's just where the freight is and where we're operating. We just recently put down about $10,000 to fix one of the areas in the freight area that needed repair. But the RTC hasn't done any of these things. Our bridge over the San Lorenzo River costs us $20,000 a year. The RTC has not put out that money. Now they are sitting on a fair amount of Measure D money, which they have not spent. And one reason that they say they haven't spent it is because when FEMA was supposed to reimburse them for damage to the 2017 floods at washout on the line, which the RTC then repaired, but they say that FEMA has not yet reimbursed them. It's a bit of a mystery as to why FEMA reimburses.
Okay, I had that in my notes that in 2019, Guy Preston was pressed by the California Transportation commissioners that said, do you have the resources to get the line back up and running after the 2017 damage? And he said, yes, we do. We're eligible for storm damage from FEMA and Cal OES. We know that FEMA pays. And so just, I had the same question for you. So it sounds like we both have the same question.
Yeah. And
that was in 2019.
There's deferred rate maintenance on the trestles. The one in Seascape needs some shoring up. One of the bridges over Capitola probably has to be replaced. They are expensive, but RTC has not expended much in that along those lines.
Yeah. And, sort of back to the question about Roaring Camp giving up their first right of refusal. So how have the recent actions by the RTC staff impacted the Roaring Camp's thoughts about what they're going to do going forward, and with this whole threat potential of abandoning the line?
Yeah, we're
I said I have a note of broken trust and a cup of coffee, right? Because the RTC said, go have a cup of coffee with with Roaring Camp and figure it out.
The coffee summit and sit around and talk about how to solve this. The problem is several of the commissioners want us to negotiate. Come on, Roaring Camp, just negotiate. Roaring Camp's not negotiating in good faith. The problem is they have nothing to offer us. We have federal protection right now. There is no way they can duplicate that. And that's what we won't give up. And if they file for adverse abandonment, we'll fight it. It'll be difficult. It'll be expensive for them. It'll be expensive for us. But it's precious to us. We are not giving up on our federal protections. They are essential to our business.
Absolutely. And one of the things you talked about is the politics, right? So as a community, when we, as a majority, voted for Proposition 116, which is the Clean Air and Transportation Improvement Act, those funds allotted by California were specifically provided to bring passenger rail to our community. That was the agreement. and numerous public events and the meetings around that led up to the Santa Cruz visioning, and all the mailers led up to us basically in 2012 purchasing the tracks. Now, after that, you look at the studies that were implemented, like the 2019 Unified Corridor Study that looked at investment options across all of our north-south corridor, Highway 1, Soquel Drive, Freedom Boulevard, and the Santa Cruz branch line. That study, the end result was that the preferred investment was bike pedestrian trail alongside high-capacity passenger rail with freight. So that was the outcome of that study. And trail only was studied with the Unified Corridor Study, and it was determined to not be the best use of our funds. And then the next study that came after that was the February 2021 approved the RTC Trans-Corridor Alternatives Analysis Study, which was performance-based sustainability planning approach based on a triple bottom line of equity, environment, and the economy. So the RTC voted in a majority that electric light passenger rail was the preferred choice for our Santa Cruz branch line after looking at least 18 different transit technology platforms. So there's been a lot of background, and that was in February of 2021, very recently, that our RTC voted in favor of these plans, this stepwise process to get passenger rail approved and going in our community. So then all of a sudden you were talking about politics. The politics literally shifted. And in May, the Tca Business Plan, which was the next step, which answers a lot of the questions that our public has. How many stations do we want? How much ridership is there going to be? And what are the current costs today? How much funding is there available? The technology. For example, we hosted the Coast Futura here in October, and that particular vehicle, the cost to run it is so much less than the prior technologies, even 5 and 10 years ago, because it doesn't require overhead lines, it doesn't require a third rail. So this is now a change in the politics that isn't looking at this next step, which is the Tca Business Plan. And I just want to point out that Roaring Camp has been around for over 60 years, and Greenway was founded in 2017. Interestingly, by a Los Angeles high-tech entrepreneur that made his wealth at Apple and moved to Santa Cruz somewhere around 2008. So this is a late coming organization, late on the trail, as after we have done so much work as a community to bring passenger rail to our community. And Trail Now and some members of Greenway originally formed the Aptos Rail Trail Investor Group. So this is an interesting history, a group of private investors led by this guy named Brian Peoples that swooped in after the purchase of 2012 of our rail and offered to actually buy the rail from us, the public, for this private investment group. And that became then these people broke off into Trail Now and Greenway, which is very interesting and have really impacted our politics. And all of that happened very late in the process. So as of May 2021, after decades of work to bring rail to our community, a Greenway executive was elected onto the RTC, and all of a sudden the climate shifted in the RTC, and the vote in May of 2021 was the 6-6 stalemate, which for some reason, instead of it being stale, it just seems to that now the RTC is pushing more and more towards this adverse abandonment and trying to undo the work that we've done instead of waiting for this critical vote that we have coming up here in June 7th.
Right.
So how is adverse abandonment of the Felton line tied to Greenway? Rosemary, what are your thoughts on that? And if Greenway passes, what might that mean for Roaring Camp and our community and all that stuff, especially in light of the state rail plan that we've in the federal infrastructure?
Right. Well, technically, legally, I don't think it means anything if it passes, but morally and in terms of the momentum behind what we are trying to do and what the community wants, it would be a disaster, and it would be a disaster for Roaring Camp. We absolutely have to defeat a Greenway, and I think we have a really good chance to do that. There's just a tremendous amount of momentum going for that. I think the outpouring for Roaring Camp is just a small indicator. Those 6,000 emails are just the tip of the iceberg of what we've been able to mobilize. So I am really hoping that a resounding defeat for Greenway will really point the way to accelerate and move us ahead to get funding for the rail lines. I just want to say too, when we had Coast Futura out in October, the CEO, I was on the train with him, and someone asked him, what would it take to just make the bridges capable of Coast Futura going through? And he said $650,000. So, I mean, that wouldn't be freight. We still would have to work on that. But think of that, less than $1 million, you could actually start moving people through the county on light rail. That's just remarkable. I think we're in very good shape in terms of defeating Greenway, because they have never been in a position to offer alternatives, to really think through. They have only been opposed. Now they are proposing in a very convoluted, difficult to understand, complex initiative, a raft of possibilities. And we are in the position of simply being able to say no.
Yeah, I think part of that is because the measure seems very deceiving to me when they say, oh, we can bring back the tracks, when actually they've removed all the language in the general plan, as Sally mentioned that early. All the language that supports rail in the general plan will be removed. And the interesting thing I think about is that for us to be positioned well for obtaining funds from state and from the federal infrastructure, all these grants, when they come up, we have to be positioned well for that. And to be positioned well, we have to have the proper language in the general plan that shows that we actually want passenger rail. And we have to have all the pre-preparations and the ERRs done in order for us to apply for those grants. And that's, I think, if I were to say to the public, if the public were to say, what's the one thing we need to do? I'd say we need to urge the RTC to move forward with preparing and getting ready for applying for all these grants, because the monies, for example, I went to one of the federal Department of Transportation grant workshops, that these monies are only going to be available for a very short period of time. And that's a large amount of money, and we have to get ready for that. And I think the other thing that I would say is that actually there are communities that have no rails in place whatsoever, and they're making rail happen.
That's right.
Places like Portland and other communities are prioritizing rail and public transportation. And if Santa Cruz doesn't prioritize public transportation and public rail transportation, of course it can't happen, because we're not prioritizing it. Mm-hmm. So we have to make that a priority, and we have to say, look, we are the majority of the community that wants environmentally wise public rail transportation. Our elected officials should be representing that. And so I saw someone earlier asked, who's Manu Koenig? And he's our District 1 supervisor, but he was also a past executive on Greenway. And they also, as a Board of Supervisor member, they appointed another Greenway person onto the RTC. So it's very Greenway heavy right now on the RTC. I just wanted to mention, I know it's getting late, that in the last RTC meeting, Commissioners Andy Schifrin spoke about the confusing and deceptive Greenway ballot measure and things that we just talked about. I just note that, in my mind, Greenway wants to put in a 26-foot wide, 32-mile long asphalt trail, yet another highway. How is that more green than a beautiful trail that's now in progress and a electric passenger rail? I just don't compare the two at all. I'd rather have rail and trail and not just another asphalt highway. The legal counsel for the RTC, Steve Mathis, said that fulfillment of the Greenway ballot initiative would require removal of the branch line tracks. And Andy Schifrin reiterated that once tracks are gone, they will not come back. And that's been reiterated by a number of people at varying levels of not just the RTC, but in all sorts of governmental positions and documentation that you can read. What's your thought on that once the tracks are gone?
It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. Every time rail has been so-called banked, tracks have not come back.
Yeah, and I think Sally mentioned that earlier, 25,000 miles of tracks, and not 1 mile has, once they're paved, once those tracks are paved over, return back.
And we have this wonderful opportunity. We have tracks. There are people who are starting from scratch, who are needing to do the excavation, needing to do all the work to put in tracks, and we've got them.
Yes. Let's be more forward thinking. I would like to relinquish some time to questions because I know it's getting late and I appreciate everybody's patience. So Laurence, will you be doing questions?
I believe it is Tyler.
Yeah, no, I will.
Thank you so much, Tyler.
Yeah, thank you. And thank Rosemary. Okay, well, I've got a couple for you. Let me start off on the list. I was kind of crossing them out as I was going down of the ones that you'd already answered. Okay, so the first one that comes up that hasn't been directly addressed yet is this one. So can you give us some insight into this quote, which appeared in the Good Times and other news outlets? That's because if the rail line is declared abandoned, the RTC would have more control over Roaring Camp's tourist train access to key areas of Santa Cruz, including the boardwalk in Depot Park, the railroad says, adding it would also expose it to the risk of property rights lawsuits.
That's right. Yes. Yes, that's right. If the line is abandoned and we lose our federal protection, we are at the mercy of the politicians. As I mentioned before, they say nice words, but they are politicians, and this changes. The constitution of the RTC has already changed to our detriment. And yes, once we no longer have federal protection, the RTC could decide, or the County of Santa Cruz could decide, let's use our right of eminent domain to take this property. And let's run, and already some person has said, oh, let's just take up the tracks from Felton to the boardwalk and put rubber tires on Roaring Camp's trains. And then we could turn that whole thing into a trail. That's our property. But like many situations with the railroads, and as Sally mentioned, the railroads go back to, the term, when the country was founded, practically. The railroads have a lot of prerogatives. I remember my father telling me that during the Depression, you could turn in metal for money, but you couldn't turn in any metal that looked like it came from the railroads, because that would be sabotage. The railroads are so vital to the well-being of the country. But yes, if we didn't have federal protection, we would be subject in some cases where we only have a lease. Well, even where we own it in fee simple, eminent domain could take that property.
And Rosemary, if you don't mind me adding a side note about the rubber tires, I've heard that over and over again. It drives me nuts.
I know.
That person wants to pave over the rails and put rubber tires on the trains when we know that the lifetime of a rubber tire is short and the toxic the toxic levels
Toxic
of rubber
off-
tires are huge. We need to be getting rid of rubber tires across the country as much as possible.
I know. And
Versus
that
steel and
that
steel
person
rails.
has no say in how we run our business.
Okay, so going back to something that you'd mentioned before about giving up the right of first refusal, we had a question asking if that was a legal contract. Do you want to speak to that?
No, it wasn't. They did not put into writing that that we would have protection. It was a legal contract to give it up. The Union Pacific, before they will transfer the title, required us to give up our right of first refusal. But the promise that we would be protected on that account was not a legal contract. And, who knew you needed it? We were doing it for the sake of the county. We were doing it we were trusting in our government.
I see. So to your knowledge, are there easements along the Felton branch line that would revert to the underlying property owners in case of abandonment?
There are some, yes. There are some.
And if anything, what does that mean for the plans for Roaring Camp?
Well, it just depends on, that would be the prerogative of the people who have that right. People who offered that easement and their, predecessors. It would be a legal morass, because we're talking about, that's a really old line coming in from Felton. Originally, it connected to a line that came over the hill. And some people have talked about reinstating that. It's also another interesting historical question. So where you could find the people who owned that property and who offered the lease in the first place, it'd be kind of interesting. But it would be a risk for us, yes.
Thank you. Your interview was quite comprehensive, so you actually did manage to answer most of the questions that had come to us. But there is one last one, and this is something that could be potentially answered by yourself or Sally Arnold, if she's still here.
Oh, yes.
But yeah, it has to do with the cost of ripping up the rail tracks and replacing them. And hold on one second, let me get the specific wording of the question. Where did it go? Do we know the cost to retrofit the tracks for freight and light rail? And do we know the cost to remove the tracks? So those
the RTC is undertaking a study right now, which is supposed to give the comparative price of what they call the ultimate trail compared to the interim trail. So when they explore the interim trail, they will be looking at the cost not only to remove the rails or pave over them, but also the cost of replacing them. So that would answer that question. There has been a lot of talk about, well, the rails are no good anyway, they'll all have to be replaced. That's not true. There are some places where the rails would have to be replaced. Mostly what has to be done are the ties and the ballast. And, that's easy for railroads. When we had a flood here in Seascape, there was a washout that was 40 feet deep that went out to the ocean. And I looked at that and thought, oh my God, the line is dead. They will never be able to fix that. They'll have to put in a bridge. They'll have to put in a trestle. No, Union Pacific fixed that in less than a week. Railroads know how to do those things. When they redid the ties all along this side, Union Pacific did that. They have specialized, like like our farmers do, you know, in the fields, those specialized harvesters for particular crops. Union Pacific, the big railroads and their subcontractors have these machines that come out and they drive along the tracks and they lift the rails and they put in new ties and they put in ballast. It's amazing, but it's not a big deal. There are very few places where the actual steel rails have to be replaced.
I think that's a really good point, Rosemary, too, in comparison to what people don't understand is if we take out all the rails, 32 miles of rails, regrade for a trail, that's a whole different ballgame compared to repairing rails segment by segment or even just upgrading rails. And so
Yeah.
people need to understand that difference. Greenway wants to just get rid of all the rails, regrade for the trail. It's very different.
And I don't think there are specialized contractors that remove rails.
Yeah, it's the difference between tearing down a house and rebuilding it or just putting a new roof on.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
I just want to be respectful of the time. It's 8:30 and I know it's been a good long hour and a half meeting. So I don't know who's wrapping up, who's doing the wrap up, but I just, Maji, thank you. I just want to say thank you again, Rosemary, for your time.
Oh, I really appreciate the opportunity. And it's such a great group. So many of these names I've seen before, but now I can put the faces with you. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great, Maji, I'll let you wrap up. I know this will be available for recording as well. Oh, you're on mute, Maji.
I don't think she can unmute herself, perhaps.
Oh, how do we unmute? Ask to unmute. There you go.
Okay, everybody, thank you. I can't even thank you enough. This has been such a journey to understand where we are and where we're going. And it's been a lot of work. We have a very small team that's worked very hard to put this together for you. And there's still a lot more work to go. And so there's two things that I would encourage you to do. One is to join FORT, join the No Greenway team and do whatever you can with them. And you can also, I'm going to stick my email in the chat right now. And so you can email me. We have a campaign going as well to help in tandem with, not and working very closely with, particularly with Sally. Can't type and talk at the same time. Right. And almost put like .sally. No, .com would work better. Okay, so here we are. We have things that where you can do outreach. We also need people who will help us do social media. We're going to take the information that we've got in this Zoom and we're going to put it together into little bits and we can get it out to people. We have quarter pagers. This is something that Santa Cruz for Bernie has done from the very beginning. And we just hand them out to anybody and everybody. So you have my email. Please email me. I'll find a way to get those quarter pagers to you. They will be changed as the initiative gets a number, because it's really important that we have a no on a specific number. And I think that's it. Thank you ever so much for hanging in here.
Definitely go onto the No Way Greenway. If you want to also volunteer, go onto No Way Greenway to get signed up to volunteer or to endorse. Several of our organizations here are also, we have our little hubs and we're all working, like I said, together, but separately together to support No Way Greenway, and you can get in touch with any of us.
Yeah, there's Santa Cruz Action Network, there's Santa Cruz for Bernie, there's Equity Transit, there's Climate Action. I never can do this right, Linda. CCL, and I think I've got all of them. Maybe I missed something, but we're all here, and you know us, many of you. So let's work together. How many weeks are there left, Lonnie?
I think there's 8 until the mail-in ballot, and a few extra June 7th, of course, is the date you can go in person, but the mail-in ballots, is that correct, Sally? About 8 weeks?
Yeah, I think it's 7 or 8 weeks before the ballots are mailed. So last week we did texting direct to voters. This week we're going to do a lit drop, and we're going to have some way for people to engage every week. And, we need to pace ourselves. We got to go all the way into June, so don't burn out, but there'll be something to do every week. And when you're feeling ready, there's something to do. So I put in the chat the links for you to get engaged. Signing up to be a volunteer doesn't commit you to do anything. It just means you're going to get invited when things are happening. And we would, the more people we have, the stronger our coalition will be.
Yeah, and the other thing you can do, interestingly, is you can talk to people. You can talk to people at the grocery store. You can talk to the people wherever you go. And I've been doing that. I mean, it's really an interesting issue. And if you have information and you understand this whole issue, then you can share that with people. And they really actually want to know what's going on, which is fabulous. So I think we do have a chance, just like Rosemary said. So let's all work together. And good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting. It's been great.